Lord, I pray for this moment, for the words that I offer, for the message that hopefully they carry. I pray that you shape them and form them. I pray that your Spirit, which is present here with us, touches all of us, strengthens us, gives us eyes to see and ears to hear your presence in every moment. Lord, I pray these words be pleasing to you, my rock and my redeemer. Amen. When I was a little girl, church was just a part of life. We went to church every single Sunday, and I grew up United Methodist in a small town in the Midwest, and people know how to behave in church in the Midwest, right? We know that you show up and you sit nicely in the same spot that you usually sit in. God forbid there's a visitor who sits in your spot. And you know how worship is supposed to unfold. Well, this particular summer, because we're United Methodist, and if there's going to be a pastoral change, it happens the first Sunday of July, we had a pastoral change. And we had our very first black preacher assigned to our church. Now, even though this was a small Midwest town, it was a college town, and so we had all sorts of ethnicities present in the faculty and the staff and the students and present in our worship, but we had never had a black preacher before. And Dr. Streeter was powerful. Oh my goodness. I will never forget that very first Sunday. He came and we had not quite that magnificent of a pulpit, but it was a round one lifted up a little bit like that. And he stepped into it and he leaned forward, and I swear he pulled things out of everybody sitting there. He had this big voice and this big presence, and he thundered forth good news, gospel news. And his wife sat in the front row and she was like, amen. We all looked at her. That's not how we normally behave in church. But I was a child and I was like, this is awesome. You can talk back to the pastor and he likes it. I just want you to remember that. It just was so exciting and so thrilling to get a glimpse at a different style of worship that I'd never seen and I'd never experienced before. But one of the other things that stood out that summer, and I'm guessing now it was maybe the same lectionary cycle we're in right now, is we sang, "There is a Balm in Gilead." And Dr. Streeter had this big bass, beautiful voice. And somehow, when he sang that spiritual, I heard it in a way I'd never heard it before. It was both joyful and sorrowful at the same time. I heard things about being wounded and sin sick and discouraged that I'd never picked up on before. I'd always picked on that there's this balm and you're going to feel better and Jesus will never leave your side. And now I heard pain. I heard sorrow. And it changed the way I hear the song. Now that song has been playing in my head all week long in Dr. Streeter's voice. It's not a bad soundtrack to have, but it has made me think about Jeremiah and his weeping and his mourning. And it reminds me also of the experience you have outside of the black church culture when you worship it, when you worship with them or when you see them. There is, to outside eyes, an exuberance in their worship. They are so physically, emotionally, verbally present. They are singing, they are standing up, and they are moving to the music. They are just filling the space with their presence. And from the outside, it looks so joyful and so enthusiastic. And you think, man, I want to worship in a church like that. And boy, wouldn't I like to preach to a church like that, because right now I'd be hearing some amens. Amen. Thank you. See, you can't be taught. It is this incredible experience. But because I'm hearing Dr. Streeter singing about a balm in Gilead all week, I think back on those images of Black worship, and I'm seeing them differently, and I'm hearing them differently. I'm listening to their worship in a different way. Robert is currently reading a book that actually came to us from Beverly Allen about Frederick Douglass, and he read me a couple of sections. One section was about Frederick Douglass's experiences of slavery. He is a famous, he's dead now, of course, but a famous abolitionist, and he was a slave. He reflects on this time where there was a slaveholder, a good, devout Christian man, who wanted these slaves, these new immigrants to the shores of the United States, to know about God, to become good Christian slaves. And so he went about teaching them the Lord's Prayer. He would teach it to them, and they were supposed to recite it back to him. And if they got it wrong, they would get beat, because that's evidently how you bring the good news to people. His intentions were right, but the message he was sending was certainly not good news. Frederick Douglass also talks about the music, that Balm in Gilead tunes, all those spiritual tunes. He talks about when he was just this lonely, orphaned boy, and allowance day would come. That was the day on the plantation where all the slaves from wherever they were scattered on this huge plantation would come to the main house to receive their monthly allowance of food or clothing or whatever it might be. It was a reminder that nothing they had belonged to them. Not the clothes on their back, not the food that they ate, not even their children belonged to them. And Frederick remembers being in the woods that surrounded the main house and hearing all the slaves come from the various parts of the plantation, and they came singing. They came singing impromptu songs with lyrics that they made up to reflect their life. They would sing about their work and their master. They would sing about their significant others. They would sing about God, who they saw everywhere. They would sing. They would sing with not just the words, but they would sing with their bodies. There would be moans and groans, and their bodies would move in a rhythmic way as they walked through the woods. They were singing. And the songs might sound joyful and enthusiastic. You imagine yourself sitting in the woods and hearing all these voices coming together and singing, and somehow knowing how to follow each other as new verses are created on the spot. It can feel amazingly beautiful. But Frederick Douglass says it's different when you're hearing the slaves sing slave songs. They're not singing to express their happiness. They're singing their sorrow out in a way that will hopefully make them feel better. If you listen, you will hear them weeping in these songs. When you listen, you hear them weep. Jeremiah has this song of lament. We had his call where he made all his excuses about why he shouldn't be a prophet, but God says, yes, you will, and you can do it, and I will be with you. And he has been placed among his people, acknowledging that they are in pain. They have been under Assyrian rule for what seems like forever. But that rule is fading away, and their new king has stepped forward and wants to recenter the people back into the law of God, back into a right relationship with God, obeying those commandments God had given through Moses. And so the king had commanded that all the shrines that were scattered throughout the countryside carrying the Assyrian idols, their little gods, be destroyed, that the temple be rebuilt in Jerusalem. He even invited clergy from outside the country to come to show them again the way to be God's beloved people, to be God's chosen people. Unfortunately, he is killed in a battle before all of this can happen. And his son who inherits the throne is less interested. In fact, is somewhat indifferent to all these reforms. So the people are caught in this in-between place. They have established this history of idol worship from the Assyrians. They have shrines still around, but they've been reminded of who they are supposed to be, and they don't know how to navigate their way, and they are in pain. Harvest has come and summer has come, and they're still asking, is the Lord not in Zion? Is the Lord not with us? Is there no balm in Gilead? How do we find our way here? And whether or not we are clear on which part of this song of lament is Jeremiah's voice and which part is God's voice, we recognize that together those both voices are being represented, and their heart of Jeremiah, the heart of God, is breaking. For the people are crushed and in despair and cannot find their way forward. Is there no balm in Gilead? Is there no physician? Is there no way to make the wounded whole? It's interesting when you think back to the song that we sang to open this service, that it doesn't pose that as a question. This spiritual that we opened our service with is the spiritual that sings out our sorrow with that look to the future, that even though we are in pain now, even though we are discouraged, even though we are wounded, even though we have sin-sick souls, there is a balm in Gilead. It's drawn right from Jeremiah, but it's spoken from the slavery voice of saying, even though my now is so bad, even though I am weeping now, there is a balm in Gilead because God has heard us. God has sent prophets to us, and God has sent God's very self in the form of Jesus Christ. So in my broken place, there is a balm in Gilead to make the wounded whole. There is a balm in Gilead to cure the sin-sick soul. When you listen, you can hear the weeping, but the weeping also points you in the direction of the need for hope. There is weeping in the songs of slavery. There is weeping in these spirituals, but there is weeping in our culture right now. And it might not sound like weeping. Just as when you listen to spiritual sung in a black congregation, you might not recognize the weeping that lies underneath it, but it is there. The weeping that is going on in our culture right now looks very different. It might come across as angry. It might come across as defiant. It might come across as polarizing, us and them language, political language. There is weeping, and if we listen below, underneath what is being said, we will hear people saying that they are broken and they feel like they are on the outside and they long to be made whole. Made whole not with the heavy-handed of one who beats, but with the healing balm of Gilead. As we prepare to come to this table and share in this feast, I am reminded of this one little snippet from the book Robert's been reading about when Frederick Douglass was very young. He had just been taken to this second plantation by his grandmother and left. His parents were dead. He had some distant relatives at this plantation, but essentially he was alone and lonely, 7, 8, 9 years old, on his own. He was there to be a companion to the child of the manor. And he was often cold and often hungry. He talks about in January and February that his clothing was just kind of a long nightshirt, and bare feet, and he would be so cold that he would occasionally steal a feed sack and pull it up over his head and tuck himself in as much as possible and sleep up against the wall of the kitchen trying to keep warm. And he talks about hunger. There was a time early on in his stay there when he was 7 or 8 years old where he got in a fight and he got a bad cut to the head. And the adult daughter of the master saw and invited him in to her home, invited him into her parlor, a place he'd probably never set foot in before. This dirty, raggedy, bloody boy was invited into the parlor, and she cleaned the blood from his head, and she applied a balm and white linen bandage. To that little lonely boy, she was the epitome of compassion. It was the first time he had experienced a gentle touch from a white person ever, and he felt that she must in some way love him. She must in some way see something in him that is worthy. It's worthy of care. And he began to take to kind of hanging out underneath the back kitchen windows. And he could smell the bread baking and the meals, and he would start to sing. Now, Frederick Douglass doesn't recite what songs he sang. He sang the songs of the slaves in this childish voice. And very soon, the woman realized he was calling out. He was calling out of hunger. And she would bring him a piece of bread and a smile. For him, that bite of bread he received from a kind and compassionate hand gave him that look, that glimpse, that glimmer of hope for a better way. She listened in the childish treble, singing slave songs outside her window. She listened and she heard the weeping, and she brought love and bread. As you come to this table, as you eat of the bread and the cup that we share, receive it in this way, that this is the bread to fill your deepest hunger. This is the cup to remind you of how we are united and that you are forgiven and beloved. This is the table of God's grace and God's love. God listens to the weeping. We are called to listen to the weeping. And all the people say, Amen.